So I'm going to talk today about one of the most famous psychiatrists of all time, one of the sort of foundational figures in psychiatry, and his name was Carl Jung. He existed over 100 years ago. He started writing over 100 years ago now, and he was one of the students of Sigmund Freud. One of the originals and one of the greats. And in my opinion, he's the psychiatrist who I am most inspired by and who I most admire from the sort of founding fathers, if you like, of our profession. He had some theories and some ways of understanding the world that I believe went even deeper than Freud. He had a schism with Freud in the end because he took things even further to an extent that Freud didn't himself like. But I'm very much an adherent of the philosophies of Carl Jung, and many of you in this channel I'm sure will be and will have heard of him too. One of the things that Carl Jung did is he actually described some phenomenon in the human sort of mental sphere that essentially predict the emergence of Trump and MAGA and phenomenon like this throughout human history. And he had a really good way of detailing how and why that actually happens. Now, Carl Jung described not only a conscious and an unconscious mind, which Freud did too, i.e. the idea that there's a part of our mind that we're aware of, that we're kind of open about, that we have complete cognizance of. But underneath that is an unconscious world. There's part of us that we don't even know really, that we're being driven by, that we're not actually aware of, that we don't have full awareness of around, but that often drives our behaviors. And he agreed with Freud on that. But where Carl Jung took it further is the idea that there's also a collective unconscious. There's actually a part of our unconscious that is connected up to all human beings and connected up to sort of groups of people as well within our societies, within our countries, and that there's certain sort of mindsets, there's certain kind of collective mental experiences that are shared on a large basis. And these widespread connected unconscious drives will move whole societies in the way they behave and what they do. And he talked about a big part of that collective unconscious was the shadow, a collective shadow that we have. So we all have a personal shadow and we all have a collective shadow. And what the shadow meant, and that's a good part of Jung's teaching, was about something called the shadow, which is the part of us that we basically suppress and deny, the part of us that we don't want to acknowledge, that's inconvenient, that's kind of not really nice to think about or confront. And that's the part of us that contains our negative emotions, instincts and desires. So the part of us that is a bit more animalistic, that sort of would discard any sort of compassion or consideration of other people, of other species, that sort of more selfish, and that is generally considered undesirable. So that part of us exists in us all. There's those sort of selfishness, those drives that exist within us all, and Jung referred to them as a shadow. And what Jung also described is that collectively there's a shadow within us as well. So societies will have a shadow within that society. That sort of selfish underlying part of us that is part of our collective story, our collective mythology. And this, you see this in countries. So let's look at the American shadow, for example. We know that in American history there were terrible crimes committed in the formulation and the foundation of America in the first place. The genocide basically that was conducted against Native Americans during the creation of America. Now, this is often suppressed. And what happens is it forms a shadow amongst the American psyche. This shadow takes the form of a belief that actually we're superior, we're greater than any other nation, we're the finest people on earth, the exceptional nation, we can do no wrong, we have the wisest and the most talented people. This idea that there's nothing they can learn, that there's no growth to be had here, that there's no point of any introspection, there's no point of any remorse or any regret or any learning, because we are great. We are fantastic, and there's nothing to apologize for, to rethink, to recalibrate, to reconsider. There is only our greatness, and that's it. So it's this sort of infantile position, really, this collective shadow that exists in America. Now, all countries will have shadows like that. Some countries will have done shadow work to integrate that part of themselves more than others. So let's look at Germany, for example. Germany has a shadow, of course. That shadow ran out of control during World War II when they believed themselves to be superior than all other people and started to kill millions of people, and specifically, particularly Jews, in the belief that they were inferior and the German race was superior and therefore deserved to put others down. Now, the Germans, because that happened to them, have been forced into doing some integration work with their shadow, forced into coming to terms with the fact that they do have that part of their psyche, that part of their national psyche exists. And what they've done is they have actually engaged in memorials, taught young people about this part of their history which they are ashamed of, rightly, but also talked about the way in which they need to protect themselves from that exists within themselves, and they pass laws around preventing anti-Semitism and all of these things as a result of that. So there's been integration with the shadow, not denial of it, not saying, well, we're superior, we're great, we don't have to worry about it, but actually, yeah, we have flaws, and we need to do some work around integrating that, being aware of that, and also trying to make policies that enable us to maintain on a straight, more compassionate, more humane path than the ones we are at risk of falling into sometimes. So that's an example of a country that has a shadow that they integrated with. The UK has a shadow to do with its empire, to do with a lot of the harm that it caused people around the world in colonial times. But this is often denied again. There's a collective shadow, and Britain is great, and we can do no wrong, and we'll always be the leaders of the world if we're only set free. And this is what led to Brexit. The sort of re-emergence of the collective shadow, and it's still rearing its head, often now in this country. So we're in a similar direction as America, but America's gone even further by electing Trump. So in the States there is this shadow, this idea that America is great, that America can do no wrong, that they never have done any wrong, that there's nothing to apologize for, nothing to learn about. And that is the collective shadow of the US. And that is exactly what Carl Jung predicted, that there are these collective shadows, and that kind of exists, as we've seen in the States. And what he said is that the collective shadow has a bit of an allure. It's kind of constantly beckoning us towards it, to fall into it. This sort of notion that, yeah, why don't you just believe this stuff? Why don't you just go along with this idea that we are actually brilliant and we have nothing to work on? We have nothing to do, we have nothing to perfect, we're already perfect. This idea of this sort of collective shadow, this flawlessness, is something that makes you feel good about yourself if you believe it. And so there's this constant temptation to surrender to the shadow that exists. And that is basically what has happened in MAGA. They've surrendered to their shadow. It's always been there. That MAGA strand has always been there. But they never really allowed it to come to the fore in this way, to become a movement in this way, to become conscious in this way, to fuse themselves with their shadow, which is basically what Jung said can happen sometimes. People can fuse themselves with their shadow. And then this whole community becomes the shadow itself. And that's what seems to have happened here. Now, interestingly, US politicians in the past have been aware of this. Take, for example, the late John McCain. During the presidential election campaign when he ran against Barack Obama, many of you will remember the genuinely dignified and admirable way in which, when there's a woman who stood up and said in one of his town halls that Barack Obama, I don't want to support him, I don't like him because he's a Muslim, he stopped her in her tracks, and he said, look, that's not true, she's not a Muslim. He and I may have disagreements, but he's a decent American, decent man, he's a Christian, he's not a Muslim, not that there's anything wrong with that, but that is not who he is, so don't mischaracterize him. And then at other times McCain had actually said in media interviews that there is a dark side to the American psyche, and you can mind that for political opportunism, but it's not good for the country, and it isn't what we should be doing. So he knew that there was an awareness of this dark side, which all countries have, and he knew that it isn't something that we should be doing to try to win political success. But he could see it over there, But what's happened now with MAGA is they have fused into their shadow. They have surrendered to their shadow. Their shadow has become who they are. And what happens when you surrender to the shadow is that logic is denied, that you prefer comfort to reason. You prefer untruth to truth because it maintains the mythology. You have to maintain the mythology at all costs. So it's not actually that they're intellectually lacking. They're not stupid. MAGA are not dumb. Okay, unfortunately, a lot of people like to caricature it that, oh, they're just stupid. They're not dumb people, actually. But they have allowed themselves to become overwhelmed by, to become kind of seduced by the shadow within them, within the collective psyche. And they've been overtaken by that to the extent where they're no longer interested in using their critical faculties. It's not that they don't have those critical faculties, but they're not interested in using those critical faculties anymore because they're bathing in the luxury of the shadow. the luxury of feeling like we have always been right. We're part of a community that has always been great. We always will be. There's nothing for us to learn, nothing for us to deny, nothing for us to think twice about or to grow around. It's anti-growth. It's anti-development of any kind. So this sort of seduction into the shadow it's always a possibility that exists, and it's what's happened. Now, what can lead to that? Well, there's a particular character. So as well as describing the conscious and unconscious minds and the collective unconscious that Jung described, he also described archetypes, which are certain kinds of people, certain kinds of character that recur throughout history and that have a particular role. And one specific archetype that he described was the fool. He called it the fool, and he doesn't mean it in terms of sort of the idiot, but the fool in terms of just like the court jester. You know, in royal courts, there's usually someone who's the fool, who sort of wears those hats with the sort of pointy things with bells on them and multicoloured attire, with a bit of a stick, and they're sort of leaping around the court and making people laugh and prodding jokes and making fun. So this is the fool archetype, and this is what basically the fool does, is that they are very impulsive characters. So they will act on their whims, they'll act on their instincts and their drives, rather than being people who deeply consider things. And what they do is they will, they're not lacking in intelligence, they actually have enough intelligence to poke fun at people, to actually look at where the contradictions lie, look at where the hypocrisies are, and essentially sort of poke fun at the way in which people are struggling to maintain, a humane life. They will actually start to ridicule people for trying to do the right thing. They will be cheeky. They will start to characterize certain people, as crooked, as insincere. They'll find little things and they'll blow them up, and they'll sort of make satirical jokes about them and deride them and belittle people in authority and the status quo and the way the system works, and they'll just poke fun at everything. And they're not serious, of course. They enjoy putting people down, and they sort of love the role of the one who sort of says what other people are afraid to say. So they're sort of cheeky, they're impulsive, and effectively they're speaking from the shadow. They are the sort of manifestation of the shadow in some senses. They're like the ambassador of the shadow. They're coming out and they're talking about the things that other people are afraid to talk about. They're talking about the way in which, all this, for example, in contemporary parlance, we might say all of this DEI stuff, all of this sort of equality, this is all rubbish. We should just do what we want and say what we want and offend whoever we like. Who cares about that? Kind of, this is an animalistic side of us. So the fool performs that function and is the part of people that they deep down inside they wish they could express. The fool expresses it for them, which is why people keep them around. And the fool also can have this role of being a bit like the Pied Piper. So as the ambassador for the shadow, he's like the Pied Piper who can get people to follow him in the end, all the way into the cave of the shadow. So how does a society end up falling into the lure of the shadow? Well, when you have a fool type character like Donald Trump. If you note, often when Donald Trump speaks, he's actually being quite satirical. He's being quite amusing. He's half joking about things, and so his entire shtick is a half joke. His entire persona, his whole political philosophy, it's all basically a bit of a joke. And he's, that joke is at the expense of disabled people, of immigrants, of women, of transgender people, of gay people. So many people are victims of his joke, but he's enjoying that joke at all of these people's expense, and he's turned it into a political philosophy because it's alluring to people to not be checking themselves, to not be sort of aware of others, to not be decent, to people in society. And he's giving them that excuse that, you come along with me. He's sort of floating in this well of the shadow and saying, look, it's all right down here. It's fun. It's so much easier than anything you've had to do before. You don't have to try anymore. Just succumb to your most base instincts. And then people fall into that. And you see people, whether, going all the way back, whether it's J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, or all these people who were diametrically opposed to Trump before, who said how they were disgusted by Trump, the fool, and his calling to the shadow. It's nonsense, as J.D. Vance put it. It's sort of, he said it was like sort of like an opiate. It was exactly right. He was exactly right. Trump was like a drug to people, lulling them into this sort of sense of enjoyment and happiness, but it was actually deeply toxic. And yet those people themselves now have followed the Pied Piper. They followed the fool into the shadow. So this archetype that Trump was described by Jung nearly 100 years ago, okay, where he talked about the fool. And that he almost described Trump to a T. He almost perfectly described Trump in this archetype of the fool. And he perfectly described MAGA in his description of the shadow and the way in which the shadow can become fused with the identity, with the reality of people, where they stop adhering to the actual bounds of reality and reason and start to luxuriate in the sort of tepid waters of the falsifying shadow. Now, Jung was born in the late 19th century, about 1875, and he died in 1961. And so during his professional life, he actually saw World War I and World War II. And prior to World War I and World War II coming, he actually saw it coming. He could see the way in which the shadow was becoming fused with the identity of people in Europe, and particularly people in his home country of Germany and Austria. And he was deeply troubled by the way in which he could see, this unconscious part of us becoming our actual identity. And he was afraid, and he saw World War I and World War II coming, and he wrote about it even more after those events, before his death, when he talked about the danger of these things recurring throughout history. And he saw characters like the fool. Hitler was also a character of a fool. I mean, there's been many comedies made about Hitler because he was also absurd and ridiculous, So the fool character was somebody who comes back throughout history. And so he predicted what happened in World War I and World War II, and then he predicted what's going to come afterwards. Just about a generation after, just long enough after, for most of the people alive to have not been alive at that time, to have forgotten about what happened there. So, effectively, what Jung was doing was was warning us about figures like Trump coming again in history. That is exactly what's happened. So, unfortunately, it is because that memory has been lost, sufficiently lost, that people find themselves again becoming fused with the shadow. So this was all very well described, very well documented by a very famous, very inspiring psychiatrist, as I say, probably the predecessor I admire and follow the most. And unfortunately, the exact path that was laid out is the one that we are following, that MAGA is following, that America and much of the world, unfortunately, is following today. I hope you liked the video. I hope you also can join me with more of my content that I'm aiming to make over the coming months and years. You see, this time around, what we're experiencing in this administration is a global trauma, and the people going through it have been asking, how can we support ourselves? How can we learn and grow and share together through this process? So I've started to write a series of ebooks. That's, together with my whole team, once a month we're going to produce an ebook to help us understand better the psychology of the people around us and the systems we're in, as well as our own psychology too, to help us navigate this increasingly confusing and disorientating world we find ourselves in. You'll be able to find those books on russellsbooks.com. That's russellsbooks.com. As soon as you go there, you'll be able to see the growing catalogue of books and hopefully buy any of them at any point. In addition, I hope you can subscribe to my e-newsletter. See, there's a link in the description of this video and also the description of the channel. And if you go there, you'll be able to fill out a form. Once you've completed the form, you'll then be able to get subscribed to my e-newsletter. And that way you can always be kept up to date about the content I'm producing. You see, the fact is that this platform, as well as all platforms, are owned by a very small number of oligarchs. And at any point, they might decide to shut down a channel like this. And if they do that, then, well, it's going to be hard for us to keep connecting. So if you sign up for my e-newsletter, that way you'll be able to make sure that you'll be informed about my content wherever it's delivered and wherever it lands. Finally, I hope you might also consider becoming a member of the channel. If you do, you'll get these ebooks for free every month. So all the ebooks I produce go free to my members who join the channel every month. Also, you can get priority response to comments, and there's also a members-only chat page for higher level members that we engage in regularly to sort of learn, share and support one another. As I say, this is a difficult time, it's a traumatic time in history, so many of us need support from each other. I'm hoping each of these things can help all of us create a better tomorrow together. Thank you.